I'm interviewing a friend that I know as Keryck, and we've known each other for 4 years. You actually stayed with me for about 3 weeks in Vancouver as part of your trip to meet emerge folk in Europe and all that. We can talk about a little bit about that if you want.
Yeah,
But
my metamodern pilgrimage. I called it my metamodern pilgrimage.
yeah, before I made my metamodern pilgrimage,
Yep.
for better or
I
worse.
walked so you could fly.
Thanks. No, I think we've had a constructive relationship around these things, and we've both been through trauma and kind of we're both marginalized to different extents, and I think we've been supportive of each other behind the scenes in different respects, and
Yep.
that kind of brings us to today, right, where I've been more outward this year, done more interviews, and you're often a contributor in a lot of different spaces online, not so much doing interviews, but just participating in whatever which way. And I think that's immensely valuable. Of course, it takes a lot of time, a lot of inputs, and people should be appreciative of it. So you're still involved with these kind of discourses of integral metamodernism and leftism broadly, with myself, and you gave me some great feedback just the other day, actually, because of my interview with Leisha Brooks. So we have that affinity, supporting Michael's content and the kind of the general struggle, and how that dovetails with this concept of a paradigm shift.
Yes.
So welcome,
And
Keryck.
hi, you may know me as Kari, Kari. That's my nickname. I use as kind of a pseudonym online. I'm actually just going to switch all my accounts to my legal name, Keryck, pretty soon. Just trying to avoid the Facebook censors right now because I had 2 Facebook accounts for a while and I didn't want them to delete my new one by using my real name again in 2 spaces. But other than that, you've probably seen me in Integral Left, as Metamodernism and Company on Facebook. I work with David Long in Integral 2.0. To give a brief sort of thrust of why I do any of the things that I do, I don't really look for citations or credits to my name. I just want to, in Integral, there's been a problem with what I guess you could call phenomenological reduction, where they take basically what they sense going on inside their bodies, and they sort of attach these bodily metaphors to social processes. So they'll think that things ought to go a certain way because of how things work inside. So they take our subjectivity basically, and they sort of think that there has to be a match between the subjective and objective. And if there isn't a one-to-one match, that's when things go wrong. So that's where you can get things that happen like a lot of pseudoscience, basically, where you get people claiming that there's consciousness basically exactly the same all the way up and down the spiral of development. So God has a certain plan for us, basically, and anything that happens in history that's like some kind of messy conflict or imbalance, they can easily claim that it's just someone going against the plan of the universe, and they can come to these specious, unfounded conclusions about where to go. And for some reason, if you look at the current studies on conspiracy thinking, that tends to dovetail with conspiracy thinking. And because the right wing, rightists in general, have sort of a monopoly on mythology and conspiracy, people end up sort of being filtered in that direction through Integral, which is just really sad to me. They say transcend and include, but they mostly transcend leftism and include rightism, sort of in an exclusionary manner by default. And I'm trying to introduce metamodernism into these integral spaces because I think while metamodernism has its own sort of reductive ideas, they get away from that bodily metaphor, subjective equals objective sort of reductionism. But, you know, I've seen metamodernism in the Nordic school have basically an anti-communist bias. You know, they look at some communist mishaps that have happened in the past and say, well, I guess it just won't work. But if you look at all the mishaps of capitalism, through all of the major attempts of capitalism have had disasters, but we don't say, capitalism is just untenable. Let's write an entire appendix in our book about capitalism. So you get rid of I want to get rid of the phenomenological reduction in integral by introducing metamodern ideas, but when I filter metamodernism into integral, I have to sort of strip away at to me, it honestly just sounds like the invisible hand type stuff that you find from right wingers, but coming from a more central position. The idea of historical attractors that are attractive to people and they win and they're competitive because they're so attractive and they fit sort of the zeitgeist and the thrust of the moment worldwide. I think that's kind of bullshit because if you look at how liberalism has actually spread through the world, it started sort of on the back of colonial projects, which were coercive and violent, just unequivocally. You can't really deny that. But then you look at how the International Monetary Fund incentivizes developing countries. I prefer to say global south rather than developing. You know, in order to receive help from international finance, they're basically forced to make their economy more neoliberal. To me, that's not them following attractors, that's survival and coercion. So when I really look into this attractors thing, it just seems like it seems reductive in its own way, and it doesn't seem that much different to the invisible hand. So I can't intervene in integral with metamodernism unless I intervene in metamodernism to strip away the sort of anti-communist and sort of vaguely capitalistic teleological idea of the next step of history. And I don't think the next step of history can sustainably be green social liberalism 2.0 if that just means, Nordic nation state, statecraft, a sort of welfare state, and tripartism where you have union leaders and business leaders meeting together. Because where you can see the Nordic countries, some of them are kind of backsliding out of social democratism and sort of going into a sort of blasé welfare state that you'd find maybe in Germany. And I don't think you can prevent that backsliding. I don't believe there's going to be some big attractor of, basically Nordic 2.0 that can resist, the power accumulation found in capitalism, where business leaders could eventually just fuck over the union leaders and say, we don't want you here. We have more power than you. What are you going to do about it? We have more land. We have more capital. We have more private property in general. I don't see that as an attractor. I don't even necessarily believe in attractors. So it's just a big mess. And when you really get down to it, when you get into like the model of hierarchical complexity, whereby, people can become more or less developed on certain lines based on their historical circumstances and their requirements for survival. Why is it that Western nation states, their governing policies and their political economy, why is that seen as more capable of providing development for the citizenry if there's more conflict in the global south, where people are forced by default for survival to have a sort of a double consciousness? They're forced to contend with our modern institutions that are being structurally adjusted onto them, incentivized but they also have their native, or I guess indigenous, autochthonous ontologies that they still have, that they're trying to hold on to a lot of the time. Wouldn't that provide more complexity by default, because they have to have sort of the master and slave at the same time?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
see any proof. I see these big assertions that the most technologically developed nation states, particularly the ones that are like, I think the term is post-Westphalian and Montesquieuian, why would those provide more complexity? Sort of, why would that incentivize more complexity in the average person if the people that live there are essentially subsidized by the sort of doubled up labor of people in the hyper exploited countries? You know, it seems like the hyper exploited people would be the ones to be, in order to survive and have a sense of cognitive consonance rather than dissonance, they'd have to complexify on multiple lines
Yeah.
just to be able to make it.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying, we agree on. I felt intuitively, and I had a hard time having those conversations with people. So I wrote articles, right? So I've articulated a lot of these things in like the articles about the difference between integral and metamodern. I tried to tease the two apart, and then my missing metamodernism series, and of course covering what I call the Dutch school as well, because it's a massive contribution to scholarship, but it also has some gaps in areas that it falls short. And getting involved with the Nordic school, of course I was happy just to have some solidarity and recognition. um but I gave it the benefit of the doubt from the start. I thought, oh, this is great. They published they didn't have the book at that time, but the book came out shortly after. And I was impressed in just the diversity in the network. But I got disillusioned with that over time.
Yep.
But I still think the work is great, but it needs to be appreciated through a critical lens, right? And at
Yeah.
least they kind of gloss over the whole metamodern theory in order to develop their own abstract metamodern theory. But at least they don't make the same mistakes that other spheres are making, people in integral are making, by dismissing Marxism or whatever, right? They say
Yeah.
we need a proper integrative method that includes these things, right? So I found great solidarity in the fact that they also critiqued Jordan Peterson, like I did, and things like that. And they really push away the Nazis as hard as they can, the neo-Nazis or fascists or whatever we want to call them. We are kind of disparaging those people because we're not going to tolerate the kind of bullshit that they espouse. So that's good too.
At least
But
not in what I call in-house conversations. Obviously,
yeah.
there's a way to sort of edge people along in a certain
Mhm.
direction when you're talking to them.
Yeah, and I've talked to some of those folks face to face over Zoom, so I think it's worthwhile. I think it's potentially constructive. But at the end of the
Better you
day,
than me. Better you than me.
yeah, they go back to their camps, and the moderates that I challenge also go back to their camps. And so there's a widespread problem of people not really being interested in changing, not really be committed to the idea of a metamodern paradigm shift, because obviously that's going to entail a lot of learning of theory and praxis, not just talking about different workshop ideas and embodiment, fetishizing embodiment at the
Yes,
exclusion of
and
other, mhm.
that falls into the phenomenological reduction that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because if you
Mhm.
fetishize embodiment, you're fetishizing phenomenology essentially, because that's what goes on inside your body essentially, and colors your perception.
Yeah.
And
No pun
it,
intended.
yeah, exactly.
with coloring. Yeah, and
Yeah, the color coding.
reductionism is a great word here, and so is reification. So they reduce and also reify the supposed reality of these theories, and to the point of just taking purely contrarian political views. And again, that's something you and I have talked about, and I think you've been much more in the weeds than I have, of communicating with leftists
Yeah.
with integralists and with social justice spaces. And so, you know, I try to maintain a certain solidarity with all of that. Yeah, so it's great. It's great to unpack this in real time.
Yeah, I'm my engagement with, I guess, social justice spaces has actually really, like, I can empathize with, you know, the people who experience the excesses of that, the sort of, I guess they call it mean green, but some of these people might not even have post formal reasoning, so it's not really postmodern. It just my main way of empathizing with the people who are mean green or whatever is that they're accurately recognizing that they don't have much power and control over their lives. So where they do stake their claims, usually in the realm of language and social norms, you know, and it turns into a sort of, you know, either euphemism treadmill where they keep finding new nice ways to say things that then become outmoded and insulting again, and they have to find, you know, nicer ways of saying the same thing. You know, they're battling on language games, or they're trying to shape social norms, so the social norms are no longer reflective of institutions, but they don't have power to change the institutions, so they're just constantly, like, you know, running up against the current. And, you know, people are still engaging with thoroughly modern institutions and learning the sort of over of what those institutions require of them to survive. And a lot of that is not post-formal at all. Most of it isn't. It's formalities, it's sort of codified traditions that get enforced on a larger scale. And those traditions typically serve, you know, the people in power. I know that's a very cliche thing to say, but the people who are in control of deciding what we learn and how we learn it and when we learn it and what the consequences are for not learning it, they control what the formalities that we use are. So even like people who are at a formal level of reasoning, which I believe is probably most people in the world, which is sort of the modern level, they're only learning a very narrow set of formalities. So you don't really even have the mental equipment to know how to fight and gain control of your own circumstances in your own territory. You don't really know how to build power unless it's using the same tools that the powerful already use. I call it the master's tools. So you have people staking propositional and language game claims and fighting using the weapons of their masters. So you get language games that become extremely sort of carceral, and people are treated as disposable. They're canceled, so to speak, which I see as more of reflection of retributive ideas of justice commingling with the disposability culture that well, basically that capitalism sort of pushes. You are only worth what people can get from you, and if they don't get what they want from you, they will do whatever it takes to push you out or try and coerce you into changing. And I don't think that that can be, I don't think that sort of freaking out about people playing those games really helps anything. It would actually be a sign of worse times if we didn't have people able to stake these claims, because then they wouldn't have any front they could fight on. They would be completely dominated. So, I mean, when I hear people complaining about social justice warriors, I mean, I'm like, count your blessings. Seriously.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you rather there just be a wall of silence?
Mhm.
And if you would prefer that, what does that say about you and your politics?
Yeah. I you know, I'm a little bit older than you. I forget the gap, but like, you know, we're both millennials, I think. But you
Yeah,
know, I
I'm almost 30.
okay, yeah. Um, you know, our generation has really grown up, you know, and we have like increasing lucidity on history looking back, right? But we grew up in sort of the Bush era, the Obama era, and that combined was 16 years, right? And so we have these very
The
clear
end of the end of the end of history.
yeah, exactly. We have these very clear zeitgeists, not so much competing, but like, you know, cooperating, and you know, it's laid plain in Obama's memoir, right? If you've seen those excerpts. And now we're transitioning into the Biden era. We have all this kind of retrospective, you know, I think it's not an ideal situation, but I think we're in a good place. I hope the left, you know, what you and I have been talking about and pushing for the last 4 years can actually start to be tabled and can start to be foregrounded. And you know, criticizing the Obama administration will be just like criticizing the Biden administration will be just like critiquing the Obama administration when it was happening, which the left did often, but it wasn't heard, it wasn't integrated. It you know, and so now we get to like look back and just hopefully with the, you know, kind of all these deja vu moments and kind of having to relive it, that will win this time.
Yeah.
That the phase we're entering will be a positive one. And you know, the Nordic guys, Hansi, kind of predicted 20 years of fascism that we're entering into. I described it the kind of opposite way, that we're coming out of 20 years of soft fascism, right? There's
Yep.
many ways you can spin that, and you touched on it with like imperialism and colonialism and yeah, how the global south has their own discourses which are in many ways more complex.
Yes.
And you know, scholars like
Yes.
Edward Said, you know, would do a great job to bridge that. And so yeah, we can only hope that we're coming into our own, and that the Biden era is going to be one of great protest, and it's going to be productive instead of just performative, as it's been for the past
Yeah.
decade. Not that it was meant to be performative, but that it was captured or it was mocked as performative. Some of it was performative, you know, and so.
Well, every 4 years you have billions, maybe not billions, yeah, probably hundreds of millions or $1 billion pumped into these myopic electoral campaigns for one nation on the planet,
Yeah.
that most people get sucked into as long as they, I mean, they don't even have to just speak English. It's translated and passed around the world, and it's pumped into our living rooms for you know, a year and a half sometimes before the actual election. And everybody's political practice is sort of tempted to become just that myopic, and people will distort things just so they can make one candidate win, even if it distorts the rest of the playing field for all of the other contests. Not just, sometimes there's actually this interrupts and distorts contests that aren't even happening in the United States. You know, people are like, watch what you say, look at your optics, and you know, essentially they're basically being forced or coerced at least to tell little white lies about their favorite old person every 4 years. And you know, it's just the damage that does to politics is almost insurmountable. So a lot of people are just checking out, and they're smart to check out and just, you know, at least if they think their vote's worth it, cast their vote the day of, but you know, just ignore the rest of the spectacle. Otherwise you just get sucked in. And one of the things that I was seeing that was sort of like the selling point for Biden was, we can hold his feet to the fire. But the same people that are talking about holding his feet to the fire are literally just going around with fire extinguishers everywhere else and putting out the actual, you know, fire of the left. The left would be the ones to stoke the fire itself, and then the liberals would have to be the ones to be like, Biden, look, your house is on fire. But they're saying, we're going to get this guy voted in, we're going to hold his feet to the fire, but they're putting the fire out. They're putting out the critiques. They're putting out like even the most banal criticism of Biden and like making it into like an existential threat. And it's like, if you think criticism of your candidate is an existential threat to the world, your strategy is already terrible
Yeah.
and insolvent,
Yeah.
and it just
It's
becomes this mass manipulation.
yeah, no, it's a confusing time, and we have to consolidate and show clarity. And what pops into my head is Bernie has said he wants to be labor secretary, right? There's a clip of interview of him saying that. So I'm like, okay, he's got some ideas. And then I see Nathan J. Robinson, who I admire, saying like, oh, Bernie won't be, I've seen lots of leftists do this, by the way, but they're saying, oh, Bernie won't be able to do anything. He'll have his hands tied. Maybe that's a little bit true, but like, give the guy some credit. If he wants to be in the administration, let's support him to do so. That's my interpretation of that. So I say it's confusing because a lot of leftists, ones who are good at analysis, are making these sort of missteps or shooting at each other, and it's a bit confusing. So we need to hold strong and hold fast and work through that stuff ASAP, because I'm very cynical that in the current kind of unfolding of things, that the left can influence the Biden administration, but I think we don't have a choice. We have to insist, but we have to just do a better job collectively. That's why I push for consensus building, for consilience, and all these things. And I wanted to mention, it's been on my mind. I watched the other night the movie, The Trial of the Chicago Seven. And like, before I watched it,
I thought it was 5.
what's that?
I thought it was 5, not 7.
No, it's 7. It's
Doesn't
7.
matter.
There was, yeah. A lot of people had been like shitting on Aaron Sorkin for months before this came out, because he wrote The West Wing, and it's like Obama type fantasy politics. And
Yeah.
I get that. But this movie I thought was actually pretty good and pretty emotionally invoking, and it's like it's historical, right? So this stuff actually happened. It's spliced with actual footage of some of the events in question. So it had an impact on me. And just to bring to life these narratives, however much it's there's kind of creative liberties taken, it does speak to this moment that we're in, where lefties are constantly on trial. It's in the new kind of McCarthyism. So
McCarthyism.
so I just wanted to mention that I'm somewhat inspired by it. And Sorkin is a lib, but he seems to at least kind of honestly portray lefties and kind of humanize them and make them funny, make them attractive and smart. And Sacha Baron Cohen is great in it. So like I say all that to again say that we've been through like kind of 20 years of kind of paralyzed politics. Really, there's been like piecemeal progress on this or that issue, and that appears to be the trend still. But we have a kind of 10-year window, as I said to Leisha, that we need to really start articulating the paradigm shift and
Part of the paradigm shift,
enacting it through the left.
Yeah, part of the paradigm shift, at least from a zoomed out perspective, it has to include that our institutions around the world are mostly modern. They're not running on post-formal reasoning at all, for the most part. And, in order to get to a metamodern stage, there has to be a stage, a long stage, possibly, as long as all the others, where institutions are actually working off of post-formal reasoning, which is postmodernism, which people are trying to skip past for some reason. And it never evades my notice that the one thing they want out of all these stages of development, the one stage they want to only have lasted 30 to 50 years and then just skip it, is postmodernism. And that happens to be the stage where people are coming online with critiques of capitalism, with critiques of colonialism, with critiques of white supremacy. It doesn't escape my notice, like I said, that the one stage that everybody wants to kill while it's still a baby is the one that would liberate marginalized people everywhere, or at least try to, or at least point out a way forward. And I think that that's not a coincidence. I think that people are being stereotyped as, you know, mean green, or like basically politically useless at best, or politically counterproductive at worst, whenever they stake claims that are against the status quo, that are, you know, require actually changing the way our institutions work. We want to skip past the mess and like sort of managerially and bureaucratically sort of finagle modern institutions to become 2 stages ahead of modern, which is just stupid to me. And it honestly just seems like a soft form of chauvinism.
Yeah, there are some great metaphors in there in your descriptions, and what comes to mind for me is, you know, this idea that you know, we're still in postmodernism, as we should be, or whatever, for better or worse, and that all these
Institutionally, my main contribution is to say infrastructurally and institutionally, we are not even there yet.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
people are sort
for
of
sure,
moving past their institutions because the institutions are such a mess and creating so many
yeah,
problems. So of
yeah,
course you're incentivized to jump to post-formal. But that is like that's cultural at not, it's not even fully cultural. It's a bunch, it's usually just stochastic individuals, in my opinion.
yeah.
And it's not coordinated, and metamodernists and integralists are, you know, in some ways trying to kill the coordination and try and skip ahead, which is kind of a form of bypass.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Vermeulen and Van den Acker, you know, refer sort of in passing as part of it to alter globalization, right? And I think that
Yep.
term should be leaned into because it actually organizes all these movements globally. That's what they're about, right? Starting from the WTO
Right.
protests in 1999. And I guess what I was trying to say is, like, discursively, we're still, you know, grappling with
Yeah,
postmodernism in different ways, because in the 90s
definitely.
scholars tried to distance themselves from it, both on the left and right, and then in the 2000s you have the proliferation of these other terms, you know, digimodernism, hypermodernism,
Hypermodernism,
metamodernism,
yeah.
and so on, right? And I came up with a list of like a dozen, and I say that those are actually useful terms, because if we just reduce it to one or two, that it's very vain. It's very like, oh, I've got the grand theory, you know, and sure,
Right.
that's what we're aspiring to. But for me, it's much more salient to, at minimum, say that's okay. We're like, I like Matt McManus's term, postmodern conservatism. That's very salient to describe what's going on the right. So is
Yeah,
hypermodernism.
definitely.
And then metamodernism has different applications, obviously, but it's for me, it's a very it describes a lot of leftist activity more than just being a broad umbrella for
Yeah.
everything. So it's a battle for these ideas, and we might as well make it explicit and get to the heart of
Yep.
matter through the discourse.
That's why I really liked Michael Brooks' contributions.
Yeah, yeah,
I think one of the best things that he said was that the right mythologizes and naturalizes basically hierarchies or even heteroarchies, and you know, power processes, and the left, as a trend, tends to historicize those same processes.
yeah. And he was very meta theoretical in his synthesis, even before I knew he was, you know, integral
Yep.
kind of adjacent.
Same. Yeah.
And um you know, he had the geopolitical perspective, and a lot of that's just lost with his passing. And so, you know, that's what I tried to foreground to all the other, you know, emerge people, is like they're, you know, many things, but they're trying to be apolitical, and that's in part because they don't trust any political sources. But then they cluster around who makes them feel safe, and that happens to be a lot of moderates and reactionaries, you know,
Yeah.
who just paper over problems or whatever. And then you end up, you know, with Jeremy Corbyn being, you know, character assassinated, and this Keir Starmer schmuck being crowned the leader of the Labor Party, and okay, now what? So the fight for that sort of disclosure and honoring the truth of history and discourse there, that fight continues.
Yeah, and you're up against the kind of reductionism that I was talking about. When Michael Brooks called naturalizing and mythologizing, if you think about phenomenology, taking the subjective and sort of transposing that onto the objective, just sort of willy-nilly, that is kind of a form of mythologization. So that's kind of why integral spaces tend to skew right, at least right of center.
Yeah,
And
if only they could have like a self-awareness moment, collectively, be like, oh my
well,
God.
they think that since they're using stuff inside the body rather than a sky daddy, that they're not mythologizing. But if you
Right.
look at cognitive neuroscience, our pattern-seeking structures in our nervous system are the same structures that find sort of like implicit and subjective meaning are the structures that also project to form sort of ideas of God and spirit. So it is the same function cognitively. It's just
Yeah.
proceeding from a different emphasis. So they can tell themselves that they're not mythologizing, naturalizing things, but they are.
Yeah, I think based on that, I'm thinking I thought I somewhat immunized myself against that just by being interested in mysticism in a kind of honest way, right? Because it
Same.
says as above, so below. And so, you respect that cosmic reflection and the complexity. And then so as you learn and develop as a person, right? Like, PhD is not the pinnacle of it all. Like you got to keep reflexively iterating. And I had a great education because it taught me how to learn and how to teach myself how to learn, right? Like
Yeah, I
that's
dropped out of high school and I got back in, and I've dropped out of college twice, and I haven't
yeah.
even finished my second year. So I'm just like,
Yeah, I mean, I think
pretty
I
much
say that
self-taught.
I say that to honor my path and to honor your path, because
Yeah,
I want to push back against all the reactionaries that hate university, right? But also say that there's other pathways. Autodidacts can teach themselves, but really it doesn't matter how intellectually or computationally intelligent you are. You have to have that compassion and be grounded and have personal life experience that supports that kind of more collectivist
yeah.
worldview. So you've got that experience, you've got the brain power, and we can respect each other's paths, and then there'll be like a mutual dialectic uh
Yeah.
discourse that's even more powerful.
What's ironic about some of the criticisms you see of lived experience, people from a certain subjective position, be it race or background or creed, sex, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, their actual like owner, how much they own versus how much they don't own. When people talk about lived experience, they're speaking from their standpoint, as it's called. And you see a lot of metamodernist and integralists criticizing standpoint. They may say standpoint is good for, empathy, but beyond that, it doesn't give you any like moral licensure or authority to speak on certain things. The thrust of their criticism of lived experience is that lived experience can't inform sort of systemic critique necessarily. However, these same people that are criticizing lived experience are leaning into phenomenology, which is lived experience, and they're using that as their point of, their jump off point where they are reductive. They may not use the same language. They may not say, this is my point of view, this is my identity, this is my lived experience, and therefore I'm going to speak a certain way and you have to listen. They say, I'm an embodied second tier individual, and therefore allow me to speak effusively about all these topics. And if you don't listen, you're less developed and an idiot. So it's the same thing. It's just different language, but they're so blind to the fact that they're doing the same thing that they're not able to grapple with, finding a more strategic and tactical way of enfolding lived experience and phenomenology into a bigger, more complex picture. The basis of it is your lived experience informs your ontology, your ways of knowing, essentially, but it doesn't give you any like epistemological extra clarity, because your ontology could be removed from, could be several steps removed from, I don't want to say reality, but there's a difference between epistemology and ontology. And the main issue with standpoint reductionism and phenomenological reductionism is you take your own ways of knowing for granted and give them sort of, epistemological ascendance, to where your way is the way and anything that deviates is the cause of all problems.
Yeah.
I just found it ironic that lived experience and standpoint reduction and phenomenological reduction, found in Integral, are basically two sides of the same coin. But
yeah, I try not to go into extremes, in different directions of those views, because, I think there's there can be value in like somebody like Kant, who apparently never left his room or whatever, never left Königsberg, for most of his life, and just read books, right? And so that's
Königsberg is literally the town of kings.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The city of kings.
So, and also, like, there's something to be said for the ability to take in another's perspective, right, through their own eyes. And so reading autobiography, or watching movies that are historical, that's how I learn about other people's struggles, as well as, talking to them. But taking in information academically is, a lot more dense sometimes. And so it's all important, it's all relevant, right? So I never would want to negate someone's personal experience, but then you have like, certain Black scholars who are sort of captured by the right, and then it puts us into this paradox, like, oh shit, how do we confront that, right? And
yeah. Well, when you strip away reducing the standpoint to epistemology, you'll see someone who is, part of a marginalized group who takes on, right-wing ideas, and you'll be able to say, their skin color, their racialization experience has only, been able to influence their ways of knowing. It does not guarantee that they will have a specific way of knowing. There's no one way to be. There's no one way to think within a specific subject position.
Yeah.
So that makes it easier. So where, you can just sort of skip past it, and you can see a Candace Owens, and someone will say, well, she's a Black woman, and you can just be like, so, and
yeah. And intersectionality is almost always strawmanned when they're bringing it up on their terms, right? And of course it's applicable here, because she doesn't have the typical experience of a typical Black woman.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And a lot of things that are basically standpoint, where the person actually is epistemically and epistemologically humble, and they realize it's just their standpoint and it doesn't give them any extra license.
Right.
Those people will be sort of lumped in with the ones who do give themselves a sort of moral absolutist high ground. And it's basically just, if you see someone advocating for a certain marginalized group, people will just stereotype that person as reductive when they might not even be being reductive. Intersectionality kind of, when you really get into the weeds of it, prevents reductionism, because you're like, literally any change in your subject position can completely change the way you look at things.
Yeah.
So if anything, it relativizes rather than absolutizes standpoint, which is why I don't understand why the people who are so against standpoint reductionism and standpoint epistemology, why are they so against intersectionality? If intersectionality basically is checks and balances between all of these different standpoints.
Yeah, those are excellent points. That's beautifully put.
I can only read it as some kind of allergy or resentment.
Yeah, I'm prone to kind of view it in like historical trends that
Yeah.
people are getting swept up in. Of course, they don't see it that way. They
Oh
see it
yeah.
as their individual experience playing out, right? But yeah, as you're touching on, if you get into the theory itself, it immunizes you to these sorts of exact mistakes, and so it is an
Yeah.
allergy. Yeah, but it's like it's yeah, we're getting somewhere, but I couldn't close
Yeah,
off that
I know
thought.
what you mean. Essentially, like, intersectionality can be the allergy shot, and people are so allergic that
Yeah,
they're refusing to take the allergy shot, and then they wonder why they're still not able to contend with all of these complex
yeah.
ideas and interactions.
I guess all I can say is that Jordan Peterson is pure irony in this respect. He's the pure embodiment of an ironic character because he opposes what he doesn't understand, and
Yep.
and so that's why he's such a lightning rod or whatever you want. But the fact remains, and I kind of unpacked this a little bit with Leisha, is that sociologically, not only do most people not have access to education, many people who get education get a kind of a shit education, like they're not critical, they are just brainwashed or whatever. But in terms of think tanks and news media, we don't have a healthy public sphere, so the information that is circulating, it's like a massive game of telephone. Everything's being distorted, and sometimes by little modifications, like the idea of vicious abstraction. We've talked about it. That's a good thing to touch on, because I think you can help bring it to life. But it's like the slight modification of the content as it goes through these society and through networks, it gets distorted and it becomes the inversion of itself. And if we could just have a proper disclosure, and kind of universalize access to education, healthcare, food, water, everything that is essential for life, a lot of these meta problems would just solve themselves. They would just play out automatically and much faster. And I said on a off the record call this morning, like just a headline I saw in the news is, Scotland made sanitary products free for everybody. And this seems like a major kind of just simple lever with very intersectional implications, and it might lighten the
Yeah.
load and burden for a lot of people and help equalize society. And
Yeah.
so,
They
and
removed something. They removed one type of product from the mercy of the market.
yeah, and to bring it full circle with you talking about communism earlier, right? Rather than totally fear this word, and of course we should historicize it and understand it, but
Yeah,
but
definitely.
but they've essentially, communized sanitary products, right? So it's okay to do that to certain sectors where productivity has kind of reached its apex,
Yeah.
right? And it's kind of
Well, I mean,
self-fulfilling.
I would call that socialization or
Yeah, yeah,
naturalization.
yeah, yeah, for
I
sure.
only consider something truly like socialist if the mode of production for that thing is socialized. So if it's produced for use rather than exchange.
Right.
If you look at a country like Vietnam, who's done very, very well with COVID, they already had things in place where their mode of production for most things is based on need and usage, and they still have their own markets for luxury commodities, so they can sort of contend with international trade and not sort of fall behind and be at the mercy of a market that they're not even really contributing to. So people have these very reductive ideas of capitalism, socialism, communism, whereby they think that if you have a capitalist mode of production, that you couldn't have socialized anything without things going awry, or the reverse, where if you have a socialized mode of production, then any markets you try and build will just be unstable. But if you look, like, capitalism itself is nothing but instability. It's boom and bust. When it's left to the capitalist mode of production, markets themselves just are volatile by nature. And you just have people with their allergies thinking they hear the word socialism and their mind goes to like this dark sort of good versus bad place. And it's labeled as evil rather than looked at as a mode of production and looked at logistically. People who are pro-capitalism seem to think that logistics sort of just ends at the bounds of capitalism, and any logistics that are done outside of that are just sort of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I would say that the mass deaths in the countries that have refused to socialize any of their processes whatsoever, compared to countries that, would do stuff like track and trace, or like zone quarantines where they quarantine specific neighborhoods with checkpoints and trace people when they move from one zone to the next. That's centralized. It's definitely centralized in terms of coordination, but a lot of it plays out on the local level in a decentralized fashion, and it's not this big scary thing. I think in Vietnam they broke it down into zones. They would tell a zone when and where, when they were supposed to stop leaving their zone, and then tell them when they could leave again. And they would have community members from each zone meet in the middle where like the zones met, and they would basically just sort of like take turns making sure that they traced each other's movement. So it wasn't like this big Orwellian nightmare. It was just sort of, people didn't feel put upon by trying to save other lives. It didn't feel like they were being put upon at all. They consented to it mostly. There's always an element of, oh, this sucks, so I don't give my full enthusiastic consent, so to speak. But you didn't hear very many people complaining, and their lockdown lasted, in its extreme form for like 3 or 4 months, and now entire zones don't have to wear masks. They can move out freely with other adjacent zones, and basically all they're doing is sort of quarantining people who come in from other countries for like 2 weeks, and then letting them do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And I think the anti-communist bias is so virulent that they take things that aren't even communism. Communism is stateless, classless, and moneyless. Anything that's basically not capitalist equals communist, and anything that's communist is bad.
Yeah.
So how can you say that a country that has 90 million people that's only had like, several hundred deaths and are already back open, and their markets are now functioning freely without without like mass death and deprivation, how can you say that that's some nightmare scenario?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
The pathology in the United States, obviously to an extent, is capitalism, but the ideological strata of that is capitalist realism, right? It's the belief of market fundamentalism that perpetuates the insanity, the hyper-capitalism that leads to the deficiencies and the dysfunction of the US.
And what I like to say about market fundamentalism is that it's kind of an atomism, where they see the market as sort of some indivisible whole that is sort of the driver, the essence. So it's essentialistic too. It's essentialistic and it's atomistic. And that can be applied to processes like the market, or it can be applied to people, where you get people like being hyper individualists, where they think the driver of history is just these sort of islands of where people are an island unto themselves, and like they just sort of work it out. But then you also have group atomism, which seems like a contradiction, but atomism is kind of like, atomism is what you view, is how you view the essence of something. You can view the essence of a group in an atomistic way, with like the Aryan would be the Nazi atomism. And I guess you could say Stalin's atomism would be the Soviet
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things go awry when you think that the driving force of anything is some indivisible whole. Because when you look at the actual fabric of space-time itself, and when you look at how our human nervous systems work, they're interactive, they're relational. So when you strip away at the relationality and you assume that the driving essence of anything is some sort of atomic whole, I think that's when you get things like market fundamentalism. That's where you get things like chauvinism. That's where you get hyper individualism. It's where you basically get all of the
Mm-hmm.
all of the supremacist isms in general.
Yeah. And I don't know if you watched it, but I debated this guy, Brian O'Doherty, right? And, you know,
Oh, the panarchist
yeah, the
guy.
panarchist. Yeah. And, you know, I'm
I'm
fine
not
with the,
hiding. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm fine with the term panarchy, but you know, he's a market fundamentalist, right? And
Yeah.
libertarian. And so that's essentially what I was pushing back on and on, you know, saying his so-called axiom, right? Axiom to build his worldview off is fundamentally flawed and missing a whole other part of the picture. And this is indicative though of most of the online Facebook sort of integralists, right? These different integral groups. And that's why that's a root reason it becomes so politically and culturally pathological. But I wanted to also say, like, at least, you know, Thomas Bjorkman is like, you know, he wrote The Market Myth and sort of takes
Yeah.
this critical approach. And he doesn't use the terms of modern monetary theory, but through my articles for him, I was able to integrate that and say, hey, this is basically saying the same thing. We need to kind of double down on this leftist policy approach because it is the kind of paradigm threshold to understand how money is also can be considered separate from economy, right? Like
Yeah.
I might be
Especially when
bungling that a bit, but we have an infinite ability to spend publicly and to reshape society.
yeah, I mean, monetary policy and financial policy are two separate things, and a lot of people don't know that.
Mm-hmm,
You know,
mm-hmm.
one's more about the flow of the money itself, and the other's about what you do with it.
And the political policy of financialization is austerity. So you can make poor people be more poor and feel poor and be more controllable, and then rich people can just have an easier kind of method of making money,
Yeah,
of whatever, creating money, while they're making whatever. But states create money, and so they have the power to create money to demilitarize their society, right? And for me, that's such a linchpin of the paradigm shift is demilitarization, right? And so, yeah, you know, this comes back to, you
and
know, where can we dovetail with the European metamodern enthusiasts, and how can we make it a global kind of political zeitgeist to
well, the way that I look
demilitarize
at it is,
politics?
you talk about consensus building. I
Mm-hmm.
think that should be concentric consensus building. So you have people who are sort of on the front lines interfacing directly with the institutions we have as they are now. That would be modern monetary theory would be the like one of the tightest rings of the concentric consensus building, where they build consensus on how to shift monetary policy so that it's less neoliberal essentially and can make more room for welfare. But then there needs to be a greater consensus outside of that, where people are saying, okay, we're correcting for the excesses of neoliberalism, but will any form of liberalism actually work, or will we constantly be fighting against the return of neoliberalism and the fascist reaction? So you have modern monetary theory could correct for the excesses of neoliberalism and sort of bring things to what's called an ordo-liberal level.
Right,
And
right.
then you have people like Hansi Freinacht who can, while I don't agree with the attractor take, like I said, their idea of what liberalism can be is the most progressive version of liberalism that could possibly exist. So, you know, they could shift ordo-liberalism into a more, you know, a more Nordic model, as they call it. But then there needs to be another concentric ring outside of that that says, well, what about capitalism in general? Is that actually, is that just going to backslide eventually? Do we need to look at, changing the mode of production itself, changing property relations themselves? Should people be able to own things that they don't even touch or see and rent them out to people? And the people who spend the majority of their time using that equipment and those machines and that technology have no stake in ownership whatsoever unless they basically beg for it. Like, how does that make any sense? Absentee ownership, rentiership.
Yeah.
We should be asking those bigger questions. I see people talk about consensus building and they want to restrain it to one of those coils. But when you try and expand it outward, they have sort of an Overton window where they will not allow for any more analysis. And that's where you get it where they could correct modern monetary theory could correct for neoliberalism. But if there isn't any wider thrust of broader politics, you could just get sucked back into neoliberalism. And then you have MMT people fighting against neoliberalism for the rest of time.
Yeah. Yeah. And right now they're kind of, there's friction with leftists, and I'm seeing it and trying to step in and navigate that. But maybe that's a good place to stop recording, and we'll keep chatting. But I think we've gone a bit over an hour, so that's a good place to tie it off. I think we had a pretty productive discourse back and forth. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I want to tie one thing in really quick. The thing I said about atomism, how it ties into your work specifically, is atomistic thinking requires by default vicious abstraction.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
To vicious abstraction, I guess you could say, is where you abstract beyond the point to where it loses touch with reality. I call it when you abstract something, there's usually what I call a referent. You're referring to something concrete that's non-abstract, something that's experiential and tangible that your abstraction refers to. And I think vicious abstraction is basically the point where you lose the referent. You detach from the referent and you're only working on it's kind of like the spectacle that they might call it the spectacle. But atomism, the belief that there's some kind of indivisible core driver to complex processes, is vicious abstraction, because the referent you would be referring to in any kind of process is a relation, is an interaction. Space and time are an interaction. People are an interaction of their cells and organs and stuff, and other people. Our brains are structured to process relevance based on our culture and our sense of belonging. So when you use an atomistic mode of thinking, you are removing the interaction from your analysis. Your abstraction loses its referent. So it's vicious.
Gotcha. Yeah. And all of sort of contemporary sociology and theology goes in the process direction, right? And so that's a perfect place to round us off. It's to be continued.
Yeah, even quantum mechanics is recognizing that, space-time is oscillations in fields, not atoms.
Right. All right.